This is Slalom Supply Chain Fireside Chat. In today's episode, our supply chain leader, Harshad Kanvinde, talks with Dr. Prashant Yadav about lessons from COVID-19 for global health supply chains.
It's really a great honor to have you, especially considering your contributions to public and private sector supply chains as well as academia. So looking forward to a great discussion. I'll ask you to introduce yourself first, and the overall theme of our discussion today is going to be around COVID and the preparedness for vaccine distribution in variety of your different roles, what you see around the world, how prepared different countries are, and what we are learning from the lessons learned so far in this pandemic. So with that, can you please give us an overview of different roles that you play in public, private sector, and academia, and we can start from there.
Thanks, Harshad. And yeah, very excited to be a part of this series by Slalom. Thank you for having me. I do three things primarily. First role is I work for a think tank called the Center for Global Development, where we try to look at policy and policy-related items for supply chains and international and global health. The second is my job as an academic, where it's teaching and research at INSEAD. And I also serve as a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, which is where I learn about some of the advances in both medical science and technology, but also gives me the opportunity to collaborate with many people who are much more embedded in how different health technologies are to be used in different contexts, including social aspects of it. So those are my roles in being both an academic and as a think tank fellow. I'm often asked to advise public agencies, private philanthropies on their work in supply chain management, which is how I learn about the problems they face. And oftentimes I try and bridge the connect between academic researchers, those who are specialists in practice, with what supply chains in health and resource limited settings often need.
Thanks, Prashant. And as I recall from our previous discussions over the last couple of years, you know that we are so passionate about agility in supply chain, and we have talked about even before the pandemic, the necessity of having good end-to-end visibility. How can we use digital technologies to that effect? And how can we become more flexible and responsive in supply chain? And COVID and whatever happened after the lockdown started just accentuated that message. What I want to understand from you over past several months, I'm sure that you are extremely busy helping with different agencies around the world. What are you seeing in terms of the preparedness, not only for the vaccine distribution, but initially it was a PPE shortage and other peripheral things, and now the vaccine is kind of coming in line of sight. How prepared different parts of the world are to distribute those vaccines to the right populations. Can you comment on that, what you see, and the role of technology or role of agility that should play in that game?
Yeah, Harshad. So firstly, I think before focusing on potential COVID-19 vaccines, since you brought up issues related to medical technologies, including PPE and other products which have been in shortage in the past, I think the issues have been about upstream supply disruption and the ability to match demand and supply when upstream supply is very dramatically disrupted. And at the same time, demand has gone up in a short span of time. And the supply chain's ability to respond to such a disruption where demand has gone up and supply is much lesser is by its very intrinsic nature lower. And the time to prepare for something like this is lesser. So yes, we can go back and rethink and go to the drawing board and think about how much buffer inventory to keep at each stage, how to build greater ability to respond to demand surges. But the difference between what we saw for medical devices in COVID-19 and the potential COVID-19 vaccine is that for the vaccine, we have some time to prepare. And yes, demand may initially be much higher than overall supply, but we know that. And that gives us an opportunity to think about allocation in a much more thoughtful manner.
Mm-hmm.
And from that allocation scenario, we can start developing distribution and supply chain plans with at least some luxury of time. And that luxury of time may be a few months. So on the planning side, I think we can do a lot more. I'll get into where challenges remain. The second thing is infrastructure, right? So the time needed to build infrastructure, whether it is a manufacturing facility for making COVID-19 vaccines, both for antigen production and for fill and finish, or infrastructure required in building cold chain equipment, both the more routine cold chain for 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, but certainly the ultra cold chain or the freezers for some of the vaccine candidates. So that is a lengthy task to build that infrastructure. And so now we are dealing with a supply chain where we have to do good planning for distribution and simultaneously think about building infrastructure quickly and knowing the timelines of how infrastructure will become available over time to go back and reflect in our supply chain plans. And that's where I think the current discussions and to some extent challenges around COVID-19 vaccine distribution lie. We have seen tremendous progress in, well, certainly in research and development, but also in how manufacturing capacity has been commissioned in a relatively short period of time. And manufacturing capacity, which has been put at risk, which means without necessarily having an approved vaccine. Mm-hmm. And in addition to manufacturing capacity, also producing some stock at risk. Having tens of millions of doses produced at risk before you have a marketing authorization is unheard of in the global life sciences industry. So those parts have worked well. And now it comes to the next frontier, which is, would we make similar investments in the distribution side of things? And what does it mean? What are the governance structures for doing that? Because setting up a factory, while it is capital intensive and time consuming, in a decision architecture and in a governance architecture is somewhat easier. But setting up supply chain and distribution infrastructure in multiple countries around the world, from the standpoint of decision architecture, information sets required, and the governance system in place is much, much more challenging. And that's where we are today.
No, that's an extremely good point. So one of the things that you mentioned in that narrative is going from allocation, then planning. Infrastructure is going to play a big role, cold chain, ultra cold chain. And once you kind of have line of sight to that, go back and do the planning again. So that iterative kind of flow and how effectively you manage your information flow and decision making, that makes a big difference. What do you see in reality? How effectively, I mean, whatever extent you could share through your work with different agencies, do you see it effectively being managed, that information flow and the decision making? Do we have the mechanisms in place beyond the physical infrastructure kind of challenges to manage the decision making and information flow in such a way that it's iterative and the planning and allocation becomes iterative?
Yeah, so I think, again, this is where I think the US, more industrialized countries and less developed countries start to see a divergence. In one case where there is indeed the capability to use more sophisticated vaccine technology, such as the nucleic acid vaccines, or in particular the mRNA vaccines, because of the unique nature of cold storage requirement or ultra cold chain requirements, most likely the distribution system would have to be much more direct from the factory to the point of vaccination. Fewer points of storage and more frequent delivery from the factory gate to the point of vaccination. That means there are lesser touch points in the supply chain. And one way to think about it is because there are lesser touch points in the supply chain, we will have better access to information on product flow. Because it's not about the system from one supply chain actor having to talk to the system from another supply chain actor. There are fewer supply chain actors. But that said, it is still a state, a jurisdiction, a health system who eventually administers a vaccine. And they are the ones who are at the front lines managing information about how many vaccinees are they getting on a given day, what is their forecast for how many would they get in the coming week, how often do they update that, and that information has to be systematically collected, matched against what has been shipped to them, what they have in stock, and then sent back to both the manufacturer, but also in this case, government agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control, so that they can coordinate how the allocation rules are being met or not met. And that emphasizes the need for things which are not new. You and I have talked about it, or many people in our supply chain community have talked about, which is how do we bring full end-to-end visibility? And our past discussions on end-to-end visibility of stock flow use have concentrated more for making routine planning processes better. But now we are saying we need that visibility, not just to make the planning process become better, reduce wastage, but we need it to just get the vaccine to those who need it the most. And so its importance has become much higher. And my hope is that as a result of that, we will see a much stronger emphasis on the information backbone of the vaccine supply chain, not just for COVID-19, but for running the vaccine supply chain in general, so that in the future, if we have other emerging pathogens, we have a system like that. Then we go to less industrialized countries, where the distribution systems are run by the country governments, oftentimes in partnership with global agencies such as UNICEF, Gavi, others. Mm-hmm. And as a result, there are additional layers in the product handoff model. But those additional product handoff points are not necessarily matched with information flow exchanging seamlessly and systematically. That's where we will face big challenges in low and middle income countries. Again, these are not things that are new, but their importance and need to focus on them will become higher.
The scale and urgency just much higher than before.
Absolutely.
So you're seeing a trend that because of the learnings that we see, or the realization that different actors are getting, because of the scale and the urgency being larger, some of the previously ignored things or issues might be fixed as a result. That might be the silver lining.
Yes, that's the positive side of me, Harsha. But I think
what's the skeptical side of you?
The potential risk is that instead of doing this to build a system, and by system I imply a supply chain information system for the vaccine supply chain, if this is done in a more piecemeal ad hoc manner to say, look, it is important for us to find a solution and a quick fix for COVID-19 vaccines, let's just somehow get it done for running large campaigns. And that sometimes has trade-offs with building a sustainable system. That can create risks where, once again, we won't have something to work with after or once the pandemic is in control. and it's a possibility that that's the direction that decision makers may choose.
So one of the challenges, I think you mentioned infrastructure. So decision and information flow is one thing, but there are real physical infrastructure related challenges such as cold chain being ready for distribution. The other day, it was public now. So the news was Pfizer is building its own supply chain distribution network for distributing the vaccine candidate. Are you seeing that as a trend? Is that the attempt of kind of getting better control over the distribution network, not having to rely on multiple players in the chain? Do you see that as a trend, not only in the US, but maybe in some other countries as well, where governments are more involved, as you're saying, in distribution?
Yeah, so governments are more involved, and I think supply chains have become the focus of attention for many country governments. But the trend you described, where Pfizer is going with a more direct distribution model in which they keep many parts of product distribution in their own hands, I think that is something which is because of the peculiarities in their vaccine candidate. Right, where if you have a product which is so sensitive to temperature and whose product integrity is something that you have to ensure you benefit by having fewer product handoffs and having as much control over the supply chain as you can. That doesn't mean that other candidates who don't have such a strong product integrity risk or thermal stability risk will also go ahead and do something similar to what Pfizer is doing. Secondly, we have to keep in mind that if it is a one-time distribution in a compressed timeline, so Pfizer in a 6-month period trying to distribute 200 million doses, yes, it is feasible, and in fact may even be better to do it more direct. But once you get to an equilibrium stage in which every year or over an extended period of time, you are distributing 100 million or so, or perhaps more doses in a country, then the more direct distribution model starts to come into question regarding sustainability, cost efficiency, and so on. And that would be the transition point where what was designed to be run entirely by the company now needs to be transitioned back to distribution partners. And that will bring us back to questions around how will the information system in the
same old problems will come back to haunt you again, because as you're saying, the equilibrium state is not fewer players. I think the fact of it's a structural fact that you are going to have all these different players if you are looking at a longer sustainable kind of time period. There is no running away from that fact. So why not design right from the beginning for that eventuality? And pandemic is just one hyper edge case, but vaccine distribution is there to stay, or other medical devices distribution as well. One question on, I think if you look at the low medium income countries and the different players or multi-tier supply chain networks there, and we had talked about even before COVID how challenging that scenario is for non-vaccine distribution even, and now you add the COVID complexity on that. Who is playing the central? I mean, who is helping these countries? How that whole ecosystem works? Specifically for the COVID vaccine distribution and preparedness for that, how those things are getting pieced together so that the population in those countries get vaccinated and the vaccine reaches allotted and then reaches the right population. How's that being managed?
So one is how's that being managed, but before I go to how it's being managed, I think I want to highlight something which is somewhat of a silver lining in how COVID-19 vaccines may help us achieve something in the supply chain distribution structure, which has been harder to do in the past. So routine vaccine distribution structure has multiple layers, right? So if you go to a low income country or a middle income country, you see vaccines sent from the manufacturer first being stored in a central warehouse, from there going to a state or a provincial level distribution location, from there going to a district, from there going to a local government, and from there eventually making its way to the point of vaccination, which means you need storage at 4 or 5 locations. And network design, when you have very good information flow about stock flow, may even say, yes, 3 layers are fine, or 2 layers are fine in the supply chain. But when information flow is weak about where your inventory is sitting, how much is being consumed, then having inventory at multiple locations means you have less ability to know how much to ship, what is sitting where. And in that context, we need more streamlined distribution. We need a flatter supply chain. We need fewer storage points. We need to go as directly as we can from the central warehouse to the point of vaccination. That does come with a higher transportation cost. And in the trade-off between transportation cost and inventory holding cost, oftentimes government-run vaccine distribution systems have leaned more towards, well, not too much on transport cost. It's okay if we have to store in multiple locations. And many attempts to show them through data, through modeling, through simulation and analyses that this doesn't make sense, we should store in fewer locations, have not yielded the kind of receptiveness that we wanted. Now, because you say, well, you don't have the volume, the meter cube volume to store a potential COVID-19 vaccine, even if it's the one that is going to require 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, you don't just have the volume. So you are forced to do a more direct distribution. You are forced to invest more in transport. And in that sense, this is becoming a forcing function to get us closer to what I would call as the optimal supply chain structure for all vaccines, period, not just for COVID-19. So that will flatten the supply chain. Flattening will do 2 things, in my opinion. Some people will say, well, I don't need to invest as much in the information architecture and the information flow infrastructure for the supply chain because I'm only holding stock in 2 locations and very easily I'll know where my stock is sitting. It was a bigger problem when I had multiple stocking locations.
Right.
So that's one view of the world. The other view of the world is that trying to get visibility on stock and flow when you had 4 or 5 storage points was much harder. Therefore, perhaps people said this is too hard a problem. We tried it. It didn't work. But now when we get to just 2 levels of storage and very fast distribution, we may eventually see a greater feasibility of doing full end-to-end visibility from the point it enters national geography till the time it gets vaccinated. And that would be, once again, almost, there's nothing which is silver lining in this pandemic, but I would like to say that would be a good outcome, at least for supply chain design.
That's a great point, and I'm glad that we are seeing more of an optimistic Prashant than the pessimistic. So far, I think I have counted three silver linings that you have called out, and these are great. I think the point being, COVID is surfacing some of the issues, and it's forcing a certain behavior that will eventually help even the regular supply chain, so non-pandemic vaccine delivery and medicine delivery supply chain in those countries. That's really a good point. Now, shifting gears a little bit and going toward the learning that we have gotten so far throughout the early stages of the pandemic, no vaccine in sight. Now we are thinking more and more about the vaccine distribution. Those learnings, and some you called out for the low and middle income countries, that how it could change the supply chain post pandemic. What are some of the other learnings that you are seeing that are sticking and might structurally positively change supply chains, not only in LMIC but other countries as well, advanced countries as well?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot has changed. A lot of things will be different from company to company, right? I mean, there are also companies who say our supply chain learning is A, and there are companies who say our supply chain learning is B. And those learnings are different because one company was holding more buffer inventory and the other was not. So they took away different things from this. But to me, the main things that stood out that people weren't thinking about as much before, one is that this idea of collaborate to compete was something we had started seeing gain traction in research and development. Mm-hmm. Right, there is a pre-competitive phase of research that many pharmaceutical and life sciences companies have started engaging in. Many models have evolved where competing firms are doing some portion of the research together. But we didn't see much of that happen in supply chain. Some of it is because of the legal issues around, how much do you collaborate when you're competing firms from the sort of the regulator standpoint. But COVID-19 has highlighted in not just medical supply chain, in food, in retailing, the need for competing firms to collaborate. And the same dynamic is also at play in COVID-19 manufacturing and distribution. So one example would be there are 10 candidates which are in clinical trials, or perhaps more, but around 10 candidates in clinical trials. Each of the companies which are behind the trials have tried to get enough manufacturing capacity, enough input material, and enough ancillary supplies for a certain projected demand. So if I'm company A and I've secured supplies for 1 billion doses, I'm company B, I've also secured supplies for a similar number of doses. If my vaccine candidate succeeds and the other company's vaccine candidates fails, then I do want to give up the supplies, the manufacturing capacity, the ancillary things to the one whose candidate has succeeded, because the world needs it so quickly. So it is forcing us to think about how do we exchange information, not just vertically across members in the supply chain, but also horizontally across competing supply chains. And this horizontal collaboration was an idea that has existed for some time, but has largely been talked about in areas such as green logistics. If we are sending a truck, let's try to minimize an environmental impact, but has never been talked about in sort of mainstream supply chain. So that's one. The second interesting development, according to me, is that people used to think supply chains are largely run by companies. So it's a firm-specific endeavor. And there were a few people, I include myself in them, but relatively fewer people who used to say, well, successful and effective functioning of a supply chain, no matter where in the world, industrialized country, less developed country, and no matter which product category, does require very strong collaboration with the government and the public policy stakeholders. That has been underscored and emphasized across product categories. So not just in medical supply chains, consumer products, FMCGs, other things, but more particularly in the medical supply chain. And any company who's trying to distribute a COVID-19 vaccine knows the amount of information exchange they are having with public stakeholders everywhere in the world. So that's a second trend, which is the cusp between public policy, government decision-making, and supply chains has become a little bit clearer to those who didn't think about that actively. And a third is the digital agenda, where I think in many places where the business case for investing in digital used to exist according to those of us who thought digital will give us the decision-making ability to great efficiency, but wasn't clear to many others. Now there is lesser divergence and debate because, once again, there is little choice than to do those things using digital, which means, once again, it's forcing people to say, well, do I have that information? how did I do that audit of my supplier in the past? Well, I used to send somebody to audit. Well, I cannot send anybody to audit. Same thing about use of technologies for learning about demand. Because the demand surges that were occurring were coming to supply chain managers with a delay, and any day or actually hours of difference in knowing how much demand is coming would change their ability to supply to a region, to a client, to a health system. So once again, proactive learning about demand got a big push. And hopefully that will lead to many of the newer technologies that we have talked about as very important, crucial tools.
Right. So I think hopefully just going through this experience, the current cadre of supply chain leaders, I think those learnings will, the theoretical concepts are becoming more real. And maybe there are new mental models now for these leaders that what's important, even from the digital agenda standpoint, it's not just pie in the sky. There is real impacts, and there's a prioritization of where to focus first versus the next agenda on the docket. So hopefully those learnings stick. And I like your idea or the comment about the collaborate to compete and the horizontal collaboration. As you said, in transportation, people have flirted with that idea, but even that was not very effective and sustaining in the past. Hopefully that combined with the digital technology and that will create some new paradigms, that there is a way to get value out of supply chain when you collaborate effectively. So
yeah, I think a general theme that everyone took away was that if you can very quickly bring new supply either by ramping up from your existing supplier or existing manufacturing plant, or by contracting with a new supplier quickly, that is your only capability to meet the kind of demand surges that we saw, especially in the medical product industry.
Right.
And so what that did was people have started thinking about how to onboard a new supplier quickly, how to bring, not in a physical sense, bring new or a ramped up capacity, but in an informational sense, how to bring production volume coming out of a new site or a ramped up site much quicker into the company's mainstream supply chain information system. And in a sense, the kind of onboarding models that some of the mobility platforms, Uber, others had developed for onboarding their drivers or other partners in their business, we are starting to see that medical supply chains are looking at how do we do quick onboarding of a new supplier? How do I quality audit very, very quickly and bring them on board to start supplying? I mean, this has particularly been true for PPE and masks and things of that nature.
And perhaps, hopefully, I mean, we are seeing that on the private side, that hopefully people realize that the previous bureaucracy of bringing new suppliers, onboarding them, what items were really, really important and helping with the supply chain value, versus what people were doing that just so that they were doing that for the last 20 years. I think hopefully there is that differentiation now more pronounced, that do the minimum required things, get the suppliers onboarded really fast, and bring new supply in the mainstream, as you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, one particular example of this onboarding, Harshad, is in many healthcare supply chains in developing countries. There is the activity which we call as pre-shipment inspection. So a public procurement agency places an order after a public tender to a supplier, but before the supplier can start shipping the product, they like to do a pre-shipment inspection. So someone actually goes from the public agency purchasing to the supplier's manufacturing plant or wherever they're storing post-manufactured output. And oftentimes that used to be the longest delay activity, because a public official getting the permissions and everything else in place, then traveling to a faraway country, inspecting, coming back, filing a report, getting that approved. And we've always asked the question, why can't you do this digitally? Why can't you do pre-shipment inspection virtually? There are tools available for it. We can also look at data to bring in alongside with just visual imagery. But people have been hesitant to do that. Now there is no choice. No public official wants to travel, no matter how interesting the country where they have to do the pre-shipment inspection is. And as a result, we are going to eliminate that step as a physical step.
One of the key things, I mean, it's kind of funny, right? So last year when we did the supply chain conference in Seattle, one of the key themes or key learnings among all those leaders who attended was the real transformation happens when real emergency happens. And now in 2020, the real emergency happened. And as you were saying, through those multiple examples, many transformative things are happening as a result. The academics and the thought leaders always knew what needed to happen. It was kind of crystal clear, but convincing the players to act on those recommendations was harder in some instances. And now the pandemic and the lessons that we are learning, it's making it evident that you got to change, and there are better ways to do things. And the hope is that those learnings stick and we go to a better supply chain future because of that. Again, nothing good about COVID. We won't wish that to happen again. But I think the silver lining argument, there are some silver linings. Hopefully the future of supply chain, or the supply chain of the future, is better because of what we learned through this episode. One last question or last series of questions, changing the gears again. As you think about, because as a role, as an educator in the supply chain space, you teach at INSEAD, Harvard, and so on. What's changing? What kind of things you want to emphasize now as you talk about supply chain to the younger generation that's coming through and becoming the next generation of leaders in supply chain? How the educational paradigm is shifting, or what are you emphasizing now versus maybe 2 years back?
Yeah, so before that, I want to say one thing about the conference that you all hosted in Seattle. So I think, one, thank you for bringing together that group of people. And I remember one of the discussion points there was that we all are clear that digital and new tools can transform supply chains, but to get strong multi-year executive commitment, we need a burning platform. And that burning platform oftentimes was thought as, oh, your e-commerce orders are not getting delivered on time, or you're in a B2B setting, your key customer or key client is not getting the service levels. How do you create that compelling argument? And so in a way, we have that burning platform, and it's literally a burning platform, right? But alongside with the silver linings that this has brought, it has created an immense responsibility on all of us in supply chain, which is by no means trivial, because I mean, I often say this is supply chain's limelight moment, but this truly has the potential for becoming supply chain's darkest hour, because I mean, if you take the example of COVID-19 vaccines, for example, researchers and developers have come together to do this in record time. Right? Having a vaccine almost ready to be rolled out in 8 to 9 months is a remarkable feat. The expectation is similar from the supply chain community of practice, academia, whosoever else works in supply chain. And if we don't, then people will say, look, lab scientists develop something which has very high efficacy, could have gotten us out of this pandemic quickly. The supply chain guys could never get it out to the 10 billion people who needed it. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that we have this responsibility that has come on us. And something that at least I am taking much more actively into the classroom when teaching MBA students or others who come into a classroom setting to learn supply chain management. And that part is that supply chains have an intrinsic social contract. We exist because we serve a need in society. We don't exist because we help marketing and sales and operations functions to say, yes, you got the stock level right, or you got the cost efficiency numbers right. And it will be incumbent on us in the years to come to say, where all do we add value to the society as a supply chain profession? So that's one part, that change in the kind of teaching. The second thing in teaching is that I think interest in supply chain management historically was most participants in the classroom setting would like to learn about Zara, or would like to learn about how Amazon runs its supply chain, or how Lego or Mattel toys run their supply chain, right? Those would be the cases or examples which would get people excited, because that's what they observe around us daily. And so most of our pedagogy got focused on highlighting those as the success stories. So when people graduate and then go out and practice, when they meet socially, the way they talk about a concept in supply chain, such as fast turnaround or collecting information from a store, they say, oh, you mean sort of like what Zara does, or you mean what Mattel was doing in its production site. Those become the examples that we all call as common parlance in our supply chain world. But that is shifting. The new students that will graduate and go out will hopefully remember examples of that small company which somehow managed to get PPE supplies in time when everyone else was struggling to source from high quality suppliers in China. That mid-sized company which helped create ultra cold chain distribution infrastructure and its associated information platform in record time in Nigeria, so that hundreds of millions of people could get COVID vaccines in time. Right? As those examples are what become the thing that people remember more, it will force our common parlance language to start thinking about supply chain management to be something that impacts the lives of people, because we'll see that connection quicker in these examples. And that, to me, will shift many of the interests that we see about what aspects. It also has a risk of going in the direction that people say, well, supply chain management has too much government interference, and therefore it's not the place where the cool startups work anymore, because essentially government takes over the market and so on. So there is that risk that some people may feel that. But I think if we continue to bring out examples of how small, mid-sized, large companies have done interesting things during the pandemic, then I think we have a real opportunity to grow the interest in supply chain, so that students who come into the classroom are talking about this in all of their social experiences outside the classroom, and are not saying, oh, operations or supply chain, well, I took that class because it was mandatory for my credit. But the social setting was talking mostly about marketing or finance or financial derivatives and things like that. So I think that might change, and we have an opportunity to do that.
No, very well said. I think especially your comment about the social contract and the social responsibility and responsibility to even sustainability, and how the role played by government and other NGO agencies is equally important, and you have to have that entire ecosystem view as you think about the supply chain. And in fact, to your startup comment, hopefully, because the number of players and the complexity of supply chain is huge, and if you think from the information standpoint, it's, I mean, what better problems to solve, right? So when you have that much complexity, I think that would hopefully create opportunities as well for the enterprising people. So hopefully, I think the negative predictions will not come true, and only the positives, that people will get excited, and the new cadre of supply chain leaders will have that new socially focused mindset. Extremely great honor to have you, Prashant, and very exciting discussion as always. Thanks a lot for taking time. and we'll meet again.
Thank you, Harshad.